Dr. Gavin Ortlund, it's so good to have you back for, I don't know, like the 10th time on this channel.
Yeah, I've lost count, but I always enjoy it, and this will be a fun one. Hopefully, just you know, nothing too controversial. Well, people will get angry with our choices for sure, but that's
Absolutely,
okay.
because today we are ascending to the heights of hubris as we endeavor to find the greatest church father. So I'm sure we'll offend no one along the way. But luckily, you've written the book on humility, so you will ground us to keep us from saying anything off kilter. But no, so people will already know having clicked on the video. But we're going to be doing just kind of a fun little bracket, if you will, of the church fathers going through. Hopefully, it'll be kind of interesting and maybe even educational for some people as we talk through these matchups. But I think this is going to be fun. We've got some interesting matchups here, and we'll see who comes out on top.
Yeah, no, yeah, and it's always the thing of the criteria that we use to evaluate people. So I just would say right up front that my choices will be arbitrary. So if
Yeah,
people are expecting to, that there's a right answer to these things, we'll just let people know they're going to be disappointed up front.
absolutely. And I think it's better to not try to establish criteria really, because we'll get a sense of it as we go, but we would end up being inconsistent with it probably. It's just going to be our opinions. That's really all it is. But I think this will be good fun. So hopefully people are seeing the bracket up on the screen now, in the future when this video is edited. But I think as before we get into any of the specific matchups, I should probably offer like a brief mea culpa. So I've come up with this list. We went back and forth on it. So we did have one change. Leo, is it Leo the Great? Does he get great too after his name? Yeah, I think he
I think
does.
so.
He wasn't great enough to make the top 16. So that's one omission. We swapped in Cyril of Jerusalem. There's plenty of people that could be on this. Making a bracket kind of requires you to work in multiples of four, and 16 seemed like the right number. So I was thinking this morning as I was driving into work that I kind of might offend anyone with great affinity for the Alexandrine tradition, because Clement of Alexandria is not in here, Origen's not in here, and neither is Cyril of Alexandria. So they're all great. They're not in here. But there's plenty of others that could have made this. Ephraim the Syrian, Saint Isaac of Nineveh. I mean, there's some really good ones. But alas, we've got what we've got, and I think we've got some really good ones here.
Yeah,
Was there
exactly.
anyone that you saw that you were like, I know, other than wanting to retroactively add Anselm into the list, that you were thinking, oh, people are going to be offended that we don't include this person?
The only one I thought of is Origin, but
Mm,
there immediately we face the question of criteria, because
right.
if you're thinking of his influence, that might shake out a little differently for Origin versus orthodoxy and other criteria that you might look at there. So already that kind of raises the subjectivity of some of these choices. So hopefully viewers will see this as just fun and
Yeah.
kind of a chance to learn about some of these figures, and not a scientific enterprise here.
Well, a bit of truth telling. I originally had Origin in the list. I have my like pen and paper copy here next to me. And then I realized I didn't have Ignatius or Justin. And I
Mm.
thought I should have them in here. But that's enough apologizing for the outset of it. I think we should get into some of these matchups. And the first one, I'm going to be looking at the top left here: Ignatius versus Tertullian. Um, Tertullian technically isn't a church father. I suppose I should give that little caveat. But I say technically like this. I mean, who I when we say technically, I guess we're referring to he's not a saint in the Catholic or Orthodox traditions, and they haven't deemed him a church father. Like, I don't know of any international council on the admission and membership into the Guild of Church Fathers. But unless you sit on that council and how that works. But yeah, so we've got Ignatius and Tertullian. Gosh, you've done some videos on Ignatius, I believe, on your channel, but he's sitting right around the turn of the first into the second century there, right? And he's a bishop out in what's now Asia Minor, I think. Is that all right? Yeah.
Yep, I think so. Yep.
Um, and he's most famous, obviously, for his letters that he sent on his way to martyrdom, which are really fascinating. I think, in my experience, they can be something of like a real eye-opening experience for Protestants reading them because he's so early, and the way he talks, especially about bishops, can be unsettling. I don't know. What was your experience coming across Ignatius? Was that like during your master's or anything? Can you remember first coming across either of these figures?
Yeah, with that's an interesting thing with Ignatius of the way he's wielded in the kind of Protestant versus Roman Catholic versus Eastern Orthodox conversations versus when I first came across Ignatius in a more academic context where the questions are a little different and you don't get
Yeah.
the so much of the read Ignatius and you can't be Protestant anymore kind of appeal. So that he's wielded a little less like that. Yeah, I love Ignatius. I find him fascinating. I think just because of the time frame that he's from, for starters, he gives you a window into. Honestly, you might say he gives you a window into post-apostolic Christianity more than anybody, just because he writes a lot about the church, as you say, and he's right after the apostles in that very early window of time where we don't have a lot of information. So I think Ignatius is fascinating to learn about. And the only thing that is a little interesting about Ignatius is he seems so enthusiastic about his own martyrdom. And so
Mm-hmm.
this kind of, a lot of people kind of psychologize this and try to understand, like, what is his frame of mind? How much is that sincere? If it is sincere, what's behind that? So that's kind of an interesting little wrinkle with him that makes him kind of an interesting figure to engage. Um, so yeah, so I mean, Ignatius is definitely someone that everybody should read and it doesn't take you that long because he didn't write a huge corpus of things. It's just getting through those letters.
Yeah, I should probably put in just an unapologetic plug. For on my Patreon, I do a book club where we read through the Church Fathers, and I remember coming when we went through the collection of the Apostolic Fathers, in which you find Ignatius. People coming across his text on martyrdom is a really it's an unsettling thing. Yeah, the way he talks about it. It's not just like martyrdom is a good that I'm willing to embrace, for the sake of the kingdom, but more like positively, I want this and don't keep me from getting it, which is a fascinating psychological thing. But what can we say of Tertullian?
Yeah, Tertullian is he's the one figure on this list that gives me the most kind of um, mixed feelings because he's so austere and so intense. Anybody who's read Tertullian is kind of familiar with just the intensity of his criticisms and his polemics, and he's kind of a complicated figure too because there's discussion of did he become a Montanist at the end of his life. There's discussion of is he a subordinationist, meaning he kind of puts the Son and the Spirit under the Father in some way, and he certainly wouldn't be the only figure that these worries come up with. So he's got a complicated legacy for sure. I think pretty much probably all Christians today would look back on Tertullian and see a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of his legacy. But then you get the word Trinity from him, and he has such an influence, and he writes so much. So he's certainly a significant figure. Between these two, well, I'll let you steer the how you want to calculate the votes here.
No, I think we'll try to come to consensus on these. I'll just add on Tertullian. Yeah, he's a complicated figure, but this is also a complicated matchup in terms of legacy because the way I think we receive them now is maybe different than the way they've been received throughout the tradition. So, I mean, Ignatius is huge for us today, but if I'm understanding correctly, like at least in the West, we didn't really know about his writings until right before the Reformation. Whereas Tertullian, even though his legacy is a bit kind of marred by his later life, I mean, he was stock and trade as far as for the medieval West kind of commentating on his stuff, right? Like you'd see him a lot more. And say Aquinas than you'd probably see Ignatius, which is just interesting the way that's come about. But I would agree. I mean, the biggest thing I have going for Tertullian is like Trinitas. He gave us the word, at least in the theological parlance. But I think I would shade Ignatius. What about you?
Same, yeah. Tertullian is the one person when you look at all these names, I'm kind of boy, I hate to say it. I don't want to be disrespectful. And you're right, his influence is huge. His stature is huge. He's a major player in the whole development of church history. But and I also feel like for me, a lot of when I'm looking at these different names, it'll just be the general vibes
Mm-hmm.
that are influencing me more than necessarily a technical analysis. And whenever someone's a martyr, uh, for me, that just goes a long way at an emotional level. So I incline toward Ignatius here as well.
All right, let's go with it. We've got Ignatius. He's the first winner. On to round two. So people who look at the bracket might notice you've kind of got the west on the left and the east on the right. That's not exactly true for our first ones, although Tertullian writes in Latin, Ignatius does not. But generally speaking, we've got more of the Latin-speaking fathers on the left. Let's jump over to the right. We'll stick at the top here. We've got Athanasius and Irenaeus. Another interesting combination, and kind of similar to Ignatius, though not exactly the same. I once heard someone say of Irenaeus that he how did they put it? They put it so much more eloquently, but like no one has been more poorly treated in the passing down of their manuscripts than Irenaeus. Insofar
Hmm.
as like he's this huge figure whose writings survive in like Armenian for us, which is
Hmm.
just very strange. I was listening to John Baer talk about translating Irenaeus's work, this huge intellect, and what a nightmare it is to try to recreate the Greek from the surviving Armenian and like Latin copies we have. So that's kind of an interesting aside on him. But Irenaeus comes first chronologically between Irenaeus and Athanasius. Most famous, I'd say, for Against Heresies, a massive tome kind of writing against the heresies of his time. But we also have a similarly kind of poorly preserved work, his Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching, another book we read in that book club, which I
Hmm.
think is really good. I don't know if you've ever read that. It's a short one, but apparently scholars when they came across it, they were kind of disappointed. They thought it was going to be like super groundbreaking, and it just sounds like a basic teaching of the gospel from the Old Testament. But it's a wonderful work for that reason. But it's kind of straightforward exegesis, and um, it wasn't like inventive or groundbreaking, but really good. But I don't know. What's your experience of Irenaeus? I must say I haven't read much of Against Heresies, just excerpts of it.
Yeah, I'm trying. So one of the few books that I have loaned out and never gotten back. So it gives me a chance to complain about this. So if anybody watches this video, and if you're the one, because I write my name in the front cover of my books, so you will be able to verify if you have my copy of this. And I can't remember the title. It might be what you just said. It's his lesser known, but it's in the Popular Patristics
Mhm.
series, and it's a catechetical book. So just basic teaching. And I do think it's the one that you just mentioned, although
I think so.
I think you're right. For some reason in my mind, a different title was rattling around, but I can't remember what that one was. This is what happens when you lose a copy of your books. Um, but I remember, okay, so I love Irenaeus, partly again, the time frame. So Irenaeus is like late second century, which is another one of those times where you have less that survives. And so it's, to me, again, I'm just going purely by instincts and emotions and the vibes of these people in a lot of my thoughts and comments. But it's so cool when you have something from a relatively unknown time because it sheds a lot of light. Whereas, like the fourth century, where you have Athanasius, we just have a lot more that survives, and so we're not necessarily filling in all the cracks of just basic historical information. Whereas second century is such a lesser known time. So I love Irenaeus for that reason. I love Irenaeus's whole theory of recapitulation, this kind of Adam Christ typology where Christ is sort of reconstituting humanity through the different stages of his life. And I find that such a interesting idea, and it's there a lot in Against Heresies. So that my primary engagement for both these figures has been their theology of the atonement, and they're both so
Mhm.
great on that. So I love Irenaeus, and he's also just a stalwart person, sort of defending orthodoxy against some real threats against the Gnostics and so forth. So Irenaeus has a lot going for him that I think can make us appreciate him. There's debates about his view of the Trinity and is this totally orthodox and that kind of thing. Um, but for encouragement for people watching this, if they want to get to know Irenaeus, reading the text that you mentioned, it's in the Popular Patristic series, easy to read through. And I found that just such a different way to get into him and really edifying and really helpful. I'm kind of curious how your book reading club responded to that text.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it. It was a really approachable read. And I think people kind of get nervous about Irenaeus. Like you hear about, recapitulation or him going through all of these Gnostic heresies, and it can be a little difficult in some ways. But it was really like an introductory uh, text to the message of the gospel, um, primarily demonstrated from the Old Testament. It's not the most like crazy exegesis. So we'll talk a little bit later about Maximus. We've read Maximus in that group as well, and like the things he can do with Job or various texts. Like I would never see that. I don't know if it's there, but it's really cool. Some of the kind of exegetical conclusions he's making. But Irenaeus, it felt familiar, but also just very edifying and very good. So I have great love for that text, and I'd recommend it to people as far as like an easy book to get into reading the Fathers. But on that note, I will say Athanasius has a little bit of a special place for me because the first ever work of the Fathers that I read was on the Incarnation. Freshman year at Moody, picked up the popular patristics version, and it was my first brush with reading anything close to that old in the realm of theology, and it made a big impact on me. But I have to see how much like rose-colored glasses I had with it. It's a great book. The preface is equally amazing. C.S. Lewis's preface in the popular patristics to it. It's about on the value of reading old books. But Athanasius is an interesting one for me. I mean, I guess a couple little biographical notes for him. So he's at the Council of Nicaea, but not as a bishop yet. He's kind of mainly doing his theologizing between Nicaea and Constantinople, so 325 and 381. And he's kind of defending Nicene orthodoxy. It's famously like Athanasius against the world, right? He gets exiled something like 5 times. And he's got an incredible biography. I feel like I would love to sit down and get dinner with Athanasius. I don't know as much about his theology, just generally speaking. Like I've read On the Incarnation. He seems to be a figure, and this could be completely wrong. You probably know maybe like the secondary literature better than I do. But like some of these figures, like Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, Basil, they seem to have like huge scholarly energy around them right now. People love kind of commenting on them. I feel like I hear more people talk about the life of Athanasius, like him standing for orthodoxy, but less about like his super innovative thought. But maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. But those are kind of my first thoughts. What are your thoughts on Athanasius?
Yeah, I I agree with what you're saying. It's interesting, these different figures are sort of famous for different reasons. Some of them are more sort of brilliant and innovative. Others, it's their influence. Others, it's like their administrative skills in some cases. Um, Others, it's sheer courage, and others, it's a mix of these different things. And with Athanasius, I think he is. That's the thing. So the one academic thing I've written on Athanasius was on his view of the atonement, and it was a comparing. It's kind of fun that these two are paired because it was a compare and contrast between him, Irenaeus, and then Anselm, and kind of different. And I'm trying to say they actually have a lot of continuity in ways that they're often pit against each other. But I love, just the text on the Incarnation. It's not just about the deity of Christ. It's really a rich explication of the atonement. So you almost wish there would be more academic work on Athanasius's thought as opposed to just what you're saying about the focus on his defense of the deity of Christ. That's what we all tend to go for Athanasius, but there's a lot that he's interested in beyond that. I, of course, have great affection for someone who's willing to stand alone. I get emotional thinking about martyrs, thinking about those who stand against pressure. There's something that is so beautiful about that, the willingness to stand against the sort of mood of the times. And if there's anyone in all of church history who you think of as kind of standing for truth in a time where the prevailing winds were against them, I think Athanasius is the one that you think of. Just be, that phrase "contra mundum," standing against the world, is like that for a reason. You mentioned his 5 exiles. He really was. I mean, he had some friends, but in terms of the powers of the day, he really was alone at times. And I just find that so tremendously admirable, to not cave into pressure, to stand against the pressure, as he did in defending the deity of Christ. So Athanasius, he's one of those figures in all of church history that even though he, with all of these, there's another factor of their personality, like how easy would it be to get along with these people? And sometimes I think that's where we can look through rose-colored glasses a little bit, because they had some strong personalities. But you have to respect this man for all that he did in standing up against the pressures of the day for the deity of Christ. So I have great affection for Athanasius as well.
This one's hard for me. It's and I mean, you've put them together in a paper. That's fascinating. I didn't know that when I made this list. On the one hand, we have Irenaeus being earlier, maybe doing some of these things. I, Originality is a difficult thing in theology because it's not always a virtue, but there is something kind of original about what Irenaeus is doing with recapitulation, and um, it seems more inventive because he's the first. But Athanasius for his testimony, I could go either way. Do you have a feeling one way or the other?
These are going to be hard choices because there's certain people you just hate to bump off in the first round. It almost feels
Right.
like this is a sin to knock them off right out of the gate. But I would incline toward Athanasius over Irenaeus because just the sheer stature and influence and impact of their thought. Athanasius has an unequaled sort of impact in certain ways. So, yeah, but I'm with you, and that's not an easy choice.
All right, I like it. I think we go with Athanasius. So we're through two. And of course, these will go faster as we get into the second rounds when we don't have to kind of give backgrounds on some of these people. But jumping back over to the other side, we've got Justin and Ambrose. This is an interesting matchup because they are very different figures. Um, so
Hmm.
Justin Martyr, I just did a video on him on my channel. I really enjoy his thought. Back to kind of, being original, inventive, creative in their works. Maybe I'm showing my hand a little bit too much in what I tend to like in thinkers, but he makes me think in new and interesting ways. His idea of Christianity as the true philosophy. So he's also kind of early second century, I think, right? And he's engaging with the philosophy of his time, and he's thinking about the way in which the philosophy that's come before has some relationship to the gospel in figures like Plato and Aristotle and others. And he talks about kind of seeds of truth or seeds of the logos being spread throughout the world, and kind of on this idea of like general revelation. I think it's really interesting. I find him to be an intriguing guy. And then Ambrose is going to be very different. But do you have some thoughts on Justin or any other things to flesh out about him that I might not have touched on there?
That's a good intro. I mean, Justin Martyr is one of those great. I mean, if you're going to read anybody from the second century, he's kind of maybe the first person to start with. Maybe you got to love the fact that he's both a martyr and an apologist. I love this aspect of your what you were drawing out of just he's giving. As you read Justin, you get some sense of how Christianity will relate to the broader intellectual world, which is always interesting to see worldviews in clash. So you see how early Christians thought of someone like Socrates, and you get a sense of that from reading Justin Martyr. So it's very easy to admire Justin Martyr, and he's fun to read, and we have a lot of what he wrote. So in terms of very early Christians, it's hard to find someone who's better in terms of just the impact. But like a lot of these early Christians before the fourth century, you also get some odd ideas for sure. Like the doctrine of the Trinity is not going to be understood with precision, and so you're going to get some quirky ideas as you get there.
Yeah, and that's a real contrast with Ambrose, right? So he's the first, I think, yeah, doctor of the church that we have. This is Athanasius the doctor of the church? I don't know actually.
I
Um,
think so.
okay, well, on this side of the bracket, Ambrose is a doctor of the church. Fascinating figure. So we're into the fourth century here with Ambrose. I think he's born like mid fourth century, and he's a governor first. So he's a governor by like the age of 30, 32, I think. I was listening a little bit about him today to brush up on him. And then he becomes a bishop, where just a fascinating insight into this time where he's like receiving all the sacraments pretty much at once and then becoming a bishop. So he's baptized, he receives the Eucharist for the first time, all of these things, then goes from governor to bishop, which sounds like a really, terrible plan to do it all so quickly. But then he has an incredible kind of ecclesiastical career. He's very famous for having the Emperor Theodosius have like a public act of penance telling him he can't receive the sacrament. And it's a pretty watershed moment for the history of the church as it's negotiating its relationship with the empire. And he's saying like, look, the emperor is a member of the church, and like in my church, if you he just had a bunch of people killed, he's like, you need to do penance for that. So he's a fascinating guy. He also left a lot of works for us. I mean, more than Justin. I'll say though, I haven't read a ton of his stuff. He's someone whose like commentaries and works will show up in my Logos account. And this isn't a shout out to them. Well, it can be a shout out to them. They're great. But I often find him kind of linked to certain passages. But I'm not super familiar with his work. I'm guessing you might be more so because you've done work on Augustine and he influences him. But what do you have to say about him?
Yeah, I have, again, with Ambrose, mixed feelings and actually a little more negative feelings in some
Interesting.
respects, which
Okay.
is, I mean, on the one hand, he's prolific writer and an incredible like public figure. Like you get the sense that when I read about Ambrose, I get the sense that he kind of wore leadership and authority well, and he just had a the ability to be a sort of commanding figure. Um, I think so. So lots of administrative skills, lots of theological skills. I think one of the darker sides is what seems like a streak of anti-Semitism, and this
Mm.
is one of those dark things that you actually. This is a healthy thing to wrestle with when you're reading church history, and you come across something, and you say, "Wow, here's someone who's like held up as a figure to be admired and so forth," and yet then you see errors and sins, and it's like, okay, what do we do with this? And that's disputed a little bit, but it's hard to deny something in that direction. So that's kind of in the mix with him. I think the thing I love about Ambrose is what you mentioned, and that's his influence on Augustine. And both theologically, I mean, it's fascinating to wonder how the world would be different if Augustine had not had that influence from Ambrose. Theologically, as Ambrose preaches through Genesis 1 in Milan, and Augustine, that's like a light bulb moment for him in realizing, oh, you don't have to read this text in a literalistic manner. And it's like opens up. He talks about in Confessions how this sort of opened up the scriptures to him, and it was like a spiritual breakthrough for Augustine, and also what he experienced from Ambrose as a kind of pastoral touch from him. So that's a really cool part of Ambrose's legacy is the impact he had on Augustine at an intellectual level, but also at a personal and pastoral level. So that's something that that I find kind of cool to study about. You see these two names, and at that time, of course, Ambrose was huge, and Augustine wasn't as well known. And so it's fascinating how we look back now and think of Augustine as the much more famous figure. But yeah, Ambrose is a complicated figure for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it the some of his strengths, even as a kind of ecclesial figure, also might shade into having downstream effects of like the church's self-conception, even though it's having a governor become a bishop and what that means for that office. I think it is really interesting. These feel like apples and oranges to me,
Mm-hmm.
Justin and Ambrose. If I was going off of who's more impactful, I would have to think I'd go with Ambrose. If I was going with like who I have more fun reading or who I'd rather meet, I think it'd be Justin. Is that a wild take though? I'm leaning Justin, but where are you on this?
I'm leaning Justin as well. Justin is more of the outlier type figure in this
Mm-hmm.
time of the church, is this just fledgling church trying to make it, and Ambrose is this more just well kind of another figure that has many other comparable figures, and so something inclines me to Justin to appreciate the uniqueness of his contribution as well. So yeah, but you're right. This is a tough kind of decision to make because you're comparing two very different figures. But I would incline toward Justin as well.
Let's go with it. I think that's going to lead to more interesting matchups as well, just as we go. Like, I don't really want to see Ambrose versus Augustine. That's not the next round, but we'll have Justin versus Ignatius coming up. So that that might be a little closer. Two martyrs, two early people. Okay, so the next one, if we had apples and oranges, we've got oranges and oranges this time. Or no, actually, I'm sorry, I'm one ahead. This one is a little different. John Chrysostom and Gregory Nazianzus. Interesting one. We talked about anti-Semitism. I hate for that to be the first thing I mentioned with John Chrysostom, but obviously he's someone whose legacy today is impacted by some of his sermons against the Jews, which I think we can own as well as two Protestants doing this. Martin Luther kind of carries on that tradition in a rather unsavory way, and so we're not judging from on high here, as though to say our traditions or anything are exempt from this. And I think both of us would like to claim all of these people as part of the tradition. But with that being said, Chrysostom, 4th or 5th century. Actually, do you know?
I think it's fourth into the fifth, if I
Fourth
recall.
and okay, around the same time as Augustine, right? Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but he's a great like pastor theologian, right? Which so many of these are. But we have so many homilies of his. He's known for being a great speaker, and he's really left us with a wealth of riches. And for our interest, he speaks glowingly of Scripture, about ignorance of Scripture being ignorance of Christ, things of this nature. So interesting figure. My gut on Chrysostom, not to like judge too harshly, is that his influence may be, and this could be entirely wrong, related more to this sounds so terrible. I was going to say quantity than quality. I'm not saying his writing's bad by any means, but it seems that his influence comes from like how much we have of this guy. We just have so much of his stuff, and it's all good. But I struggle to pin like one thing to Chrysostom, and maybe that's ignorance on my part. But some of these writers, it's like, oh yeah, this is the guy who stood for this, and this idea is so like Irenaeus in Recapitulation, or Justin Martyr and the Logos. These things, it's like that's his trademark. I don't know if Chrysostom has something like that, but I don't know. Do you know of anything for him?
I think you're right that Chrysostom is known less as the developer of a particular idea or set of ideas, and also less of a writer and more of just a preacher. And
Yeah.
of course, I think that's the term. Chrysostom means like golden mouthed or something like
Mm-hmm.
this. So yeah, so he's again the reason these figures rise to prominence is kind of different in different cases. I find Chrysostom just fascinating. I can just let the cat out of the bag here and say I'm going to incline toward him on this,
Okay.
just because partly, yeah, we have so much of him, so you can unlike so many figures, you can really do a deep dive and get to know the contours of their thought. And I just think it would be amazing to hear him preach. The difference between preaching skill and writing skill is pretty decisive. Those are two different skill sets in some respects, even though they both concern language. They're very different. And I get the sense Chrysostom was just a very effective orator and verbal communicator. And so I just think it would have been fascinating to hear him preach. One thing I love about Chrysostom is his courage. He also was banished at one point, or maybe twice, I can't remember. And there's a famous painting of him standing before an empress, the Empress Eudoxia, where that's the thing about some of these church fathers. They would denounce the civil authorities when the civil authorities were in sin. Even at their own peril. And Chrysostom is willing to do this. And you get a sense of the moral sternness of this man at times in his sermons when he's preaching. So there's a lot about Chrysostom that I'm drawn to. And the sheer influence and volume of his work, too, is kind of an interesting factor here that in some respects makes him unique.
Yeah, that is true. And then on the other hand, we've got Gregory Nazianzus, or Nazianzus. A lot of these will have kind of different ways of anglicizing their names. But one of the Cappadocian fathers, so one of the three, Gregory, and Basil, all three of whom are on this list. And as I was making it, I had the hunch that they're taken as a package deal so often that it's kind of hard splitting them up. If it was like the Cappadocians versus anyone, you might get a different answer than them individually. I would say he, at least today, maybe this isn't fair. I was going to say the kind of least, I don't want to say least of the Cappadocians. They're all fascinating. They're all really well studied. Gregory of Nyssa has had like a boom in scholarship over the last 100 years or so. Gregory of Nazianzus has always been appreciated. He's considered one of the doctors in the East, whereas I believe Nyssa is not, or he gets the title of the theologian rather. But he's an interesting figure. So they're all in this kind of late 4th century period here, right? The Cappadocians, more around the Council of Constantinople. He, unlike Ambrose, is probably a better theologian than churchman. Like he really didn't want to be a bishop. Basil kind of told the two Gregories what to do and got them C's, and put them to work. But he's left us a lot of theological poetry. He's did a lot of important work on the doctrine of Christ. I'll say for me though, he kind of blends into the other two. But what about for you? The other two being the other two Cappadocians.
Yeah. It's the Cappadocians. They do. It's funny how much they tend to go together. For people watching this, the other two, Gregory of Nyssa and Basil, are the two brothers, and then this Gregory is not their brother. But I think is the text called Five Orations or something like this
Yeah, I think so.
in the popular patristic series. That's one of those books from the church fathers that I just tend to find myself recommending a lot, because I think it's a great way to get into the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of Christ. He has incredible stature as a theologian. So I think Gregory is someone you have to appreciate for what the Cappadocians as a whole are known for, and that's their defense of the Trinity, their defense of an Orthodox Christology. But I think another thing about Gregory of Nazianzus that I appreciate is just his rhetorical skills as a writer. So he's a rhetorician, and he's very skilled with language and kind of as a stylist. This is something in the ancient world that they valued more sometimes than today. Sometimes you'll read these massive theological tomes today, and they're brilliant, but you can tell oratory and rhetoric was not the author's skill set or area of study, because it's like, sprawling and difficult to read. So it's something I appreciate about Gregory as well. So definitely one of those theologians in the early church, though, especially if you're interested in the doctrine of the Trinity, that just has to be engaged.
Yeah. So you tipped your hand a little bit early on there. I think I'm inclined to agree with you if you're still leaning Chrysostom for his influence. Like if you read Aquinas, he's always showing up. And I think, again, just that aspect of he's even though I said he doesn't have like a distinct thing he stands for, he's a more distinct figure, I would say, than Gregory Nazianzus. But you still leaning that way?
Yeah, we don't have
Okay.
a tiebreaker here, so let's just hope we agree on these, or else.
I know, I meant to grab a coin. Your
channel, you can have the casting vote, but a lot of these are tough decisions, but that's how I'd lean on this one.
Yeah. Well, speaking of tough decisions, I hate to sell the next one short. I don't think it's going to be a tough decision. We're jumping back to the left. We've got Cyril of Jerusalem and Augustine. I'm going to let you intro Augustine. As far as Cyril of Jerusalem, we've got, again, 4th century, and this figure who's not kind of fully in the East or the West here, right? We're in Jerusalem, which is kind of different than what we've got in some of the others. He left a great kind of catechetical lectures. Really fascinating, I think, to see how the catechetical schools were set up. So after the Council of Nicaea, we seem to have this influx of converts, and they're wanting to see how we can make sure that they're being formed in the faith well. And it sounds like he was lecturing to them every morning prior to their baptism, and they're going through this experience of really getting kind of the meat of the Christian faith. I've been meaning to work on a video on him about how he's fascinating and also troublesome for all of us in a good way, in the sense that, in what we do, the church fathers often become so partisan, like, oh, this is a Catholic father, an Orthodox father, this one's more Protestant leaning. And there's just aspects of him that I think are going to rub everyone a little bit, as all of these tend to do the deeper you go into them. Whether it's his canon list that doesn't like perfectly match. You've got almost the Protestant canon, but Baruch thrown in there. You've got receiving the sacrament on the hand. And you've got, but like praying for the dead, all different types of stuff going on. But I think this is another text, his catechetical lectures, that I would recommend to someone if they were first getting into reading the fathers. But what would you have to say about him? Because this is someone we threw in late. He's the one who displaced Leo. So maybe what was some of what was going on in your head when you said we got to have him on the list?
Yeah, I got into Cyril of Jerusalem maybe 3 years ago or so, when I just read through for the first time the catechetical lectures, and for some reason was really drawn to them. I think part of it is, again, the figure is a window into the time. 4th century Jerusalem is kind of a little bit of a different context than what we often will think of. Usually in this time where you think of Augustine, you think of Chrysostom. It's just fascinating to think of what were people who were becoming Christians, what were they being instructed in that particular context. And like you say, he doesn't necessarily fit inside all the boxes. The other thing about Cyril is I just have, and this could be off base, but I get the sense of a very pastoral and even warm sense from him. And, with a lot of these great theologians, if you're thinking on a Myers-Briggs personality indicator, they're going to be thinkers more than feelers. I've almost wondered if Cyril was a feeler, just from the vibe you get as you're reading him. I experience him very differently than some of these other a little more austere figures. And then, like you say, some of the topics he covers are so interesting. So I love Cyril, and I also just think those catechetical lectures are just a great. It's kind of like Athanasius is on the Incarnation or the Five Orations of Gregory. They're just a great text to give to people and say, if you want to get in, I find a lot of people want to read church history and don't know where to begin. That's just a great point of entry. It's not that hard to read. And it just introduces the benefits you get for the time you put into it. It's so worth it. So I'm a big fan of Cyril, but of course, you've put him up against a tough.
Yeah, what can we say about Augustine? What needs to be said about Augustine? I feel like if people are familiar with anyone, it's going to be him. But what's your kind of elevator history of Augustine?
Yeah, so Augustine is my favorite of the church fathers. He's just so interesting, even though I admit his legacy is complicated and he's not going to unerringly lead us in the right direction on every single particular, and he actually has some complexities to him. But yeah, so he's 4th and 5th century, I think 354 to 430. Just probably the most influential Christian of all time in all church history. I think that's probably a fair statement. And when I think of Augustine, I think of just someone who's hitting at different levels, because on the one hand, he's a tremendous theologian. And at the very same time, the spiritual benefit from reading his writings is also very much makes it worth the effort. Apart from the sort of intellectual side, just the sheer pathos that comes through in a book like Confessions. And then at the same time, like I said of Gregory of Nazianzus, he's also a skilled rhetorician. He's good with language. And so sheerly for its literary impact, the Confessions is a significant document in all of Western civilization, just leaving off the spiritual and the theological. So, at different registers, Augustine is just this giant of a figure. I'm a big fan of him. He's been helpful to me in his doctrine of creation, which has been my area of research for him. There's so much else to him, though, and he's such a wide-ranging figure. I will say, in terms of influence, there's a famous quote by Alfred North Whitehead that the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I think that's a little bit of maybe a little bit of an exaggeration for effect. There's some truth to it, but I wouldn't say that all of Western philosophy is just footnotes. I mean, but I would say it's less of an exaggeration to say medieval theology is footnotes to Augustine. As you go forward into the medieval era, at least in the West, it's basically the Bible and Augustine that set the table. He's so influential. So, and not always for good necessarily, but I think in so many ways for good. So, yeah, he's a tough one to beat in terms of whatever criterion you're using. He's tough to outmatch.
Yeah, I hate to bid adieu to Cyril in the first round, but Augustine. There's more than this, I guess. The one thing I have against Augustine is he could have used a copy editor at times. Someone had done. I just finished rereading Confessions, and as great as like the final chapters on memory and these things are, it's like, how did we get here? Like, I thought this was an autobiographical account. And same with City of God. I read that last year, not abridged. I read it abridged. It's like, okay, there's some serious digressions here, but that notwithstanding, I mean, he's got to win, right? This is as great as Cyril is. This is kind of no contest, huh?
Yeah, I think so. That seems right to me. And we can, Augustine has some funny things too. I remember reading about when I did my study on his view of creation, he talks a lot about dragons. And the big debate is it literal, like fire-breathing dragons, or is he talking about Komodo dragons? So reading in Augustine too, he's wrote so much that it's a great window into just the times and just what people thought about in the 4th century and 5th century.
Well, I'll tip my hand a little bit on this next one. I think this is the hardest matchup of the kind of first round. And we've got Basil and Gregory of Nyssa. Um, they're brothers, right? So Basil's the older brother here. We're back with the Cappadocians. Basil is, of the two, the more influential churchman. So he's older. He becomes a bishop first, and then there's a bunch of controversy at the time, and so he's kind of creating new dioceses and appointing bishops with Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, neither of whom seem to want to be bishops or particularly appreciated Basil doing this. They've both left us tremendous works. An interesting kind of thing about Gregory of Nyssa is he doesn't seem to rise to prominence until after Basil's death. And after Basil's death, we have kind of more of his works, him kind of gaining influence and being asked to write by the Emperor Gratian, I believe it was. Or no, that was Ambrose that was asked by Gratian, but he's being asked to teach to the emperors, and he's influential at later councils. And his, if we're talking originality, fascinating. Recent scholarship on him has blown up. And I think you presented a paper on this at ETS maybe, but he's one of the first, Gregory of Nyssa, the younger brother, one of the first voices we have opposing slavery, like categorically. But yeah, what are we missing in that kind of very brief overview of these two people?
No, that's good. And you know, we could recommend for viewers who want to, people watching this video might just be interested in, you know, give me 5 books or give me some books that I can look into. I think Basil's On the Holy Spirit, which is one of the earlier books in the Popular Patristic series, is a great book to read.
Mm-hmm.
Not too hard to read, really gets you into Trinitarian theology. So I recommend that one. I found it's fun to read. It's not that long, you know, and it really gets you into some of the important issues related to the Trinity. But of course, I love Gregory of Nyssa. And, you know, you mentioned the scholarly explosion. I think it's fair to say that in their lifetime and for a long time, he was kind of the younger brother. You know, he was had less influence, perhaps. But in more recent times, he's kind of blown up. And part of that is the question of, is he a universalist?
Yeah.
Does he believe in universal salvation? And sometimes disputed, but I think a pretty good case can be made that at least there are passages in him that seem to affirm that. And the only questions are kind of how you reconcile that with other passages and so forth. So that's another fascinating little factoid about Gregory of Nyssa. But I'm very partial to Gregory. I just absolutely love his social vision because he's not, I mean, it's all rooted in good theology, but he's just so I mean, put it like this, he's the guy, the first person in all of human history to my awareness who has such a categorical denial of slavery as just intrinsically wrong. And that's what I've argued for, and I'm not alone in seeing that in him. You know, people call him the really the first person who's saying it's not just that this is sort of the result of the fall, but it's not wrong to have slaves. You know, he is saying it is always wrong and it's a violation of the image of God. And in his sermons on this, because he's speaking to slave owners, so this isn't just theory for him, but the way he unfolds that, the boldness of it and the theological vision of it, and just the exalted view of humanity that is reflected of what it means to be made in the image of God. Because he actually says, you know, you can't own another human being. It's just metaphysically impossible to act, and it's sort of a misunderstanding if we think we ever do. That has such that was so unheard of in that time, you know. And we take a lot of these ideas for granted today. That, oh well, of course, eventually human civilization would get to a point where we see that slavery is wrong, but that's a very unique idea in world history, and I think it has Christian influence behind it. And I think Gregory may be one of the first early dominoes to that. So, I'm a big fan of Gregory for that reason.
Yeah, and just to give Basil his credit too, something I didn't mention in my little overview, he's often accredited with being, if not the first, kind of like the founder of the hospital system. And his text, we're going to throw out so many book recommendations in this video. The poor people. I think On the Holy Spirit is great. On Social Justice is also a
Mm.
fantastic book by him. I often say that is the most difficult patristic text I've read, not for its like reading comprehension. both of them are well schooled in rhetoric and philosophy, and they write clearly. But for like conviction value, On Social Justice is one of the hardest books to read. It maybe goes further than I would say in some things, but it's I think that he has this kind of like moral clarity in a similar way to Gregory of Nyssa on slavery, on kind of wealth and accumulation, that I know is a blind spot, like for me and for so much of the West today, I think. So he's forceful there, and fantastic. If we've got to bring it to a vote, which we do, I thought I was going to have a harder time with this, but from what you said, I don't know that I will. I I find Gregory of Nyssa a little more fun, even if Basil's maybe the one who's had more influence, generally speaking. But he'd have my vote. What about you?
Yeah, I can go with that. I kind of it's a toss up for me too, because you're so right about Basil. His social vision is very uh, convicting and powerful as well, and also his emphasis on the dignity of women. It's another thing
Yeah.
about Basil that's interesting. So anyway, which is not sadly can't always be taken for granted among these figures. So yeah, I could kind of go either way on this, but just the fun word is a good way to get it. What tilts
All
it to
right.
Gregory, maybe.
We'll go Gregory. All right. One of the Gregorys had to make it to the second round. I mean, that is criminal having Basil out in the first round. That might be the worst one so far for someone to not make it out of the first round. But one of those two had to not. So, all right, our last one on the western side here is Jerome and Gregory the Great. Both figures that I know you've made some videos about. So Jerome, most famous for translating the Vulgate, kind of a big deal if we want to talk about legacy there. He's fourth century, and also in kind of is he in Jerusalem? Is that correct? Or he's spending time around there? Yeah.
I don't recall that, though you might be right,
Okay.
and I can't remember.
I kind of remember if that's where he went to learn Hebrew, because that's part of what
Oh yeah.
um, I I'll say I've read the Vulgate, when I was working on Latin, and I've read his commentaries, but I know him as that. Like that's kind of the extent of my interaction with Jerome, and obviously all the canon controversies. He always comes up in kind of Protestant Catholic canon discussions, but so I know him as a translator and an exegete. And I was about to say those as though those weren't incredibly worthy things to do. I guess I kind of bend more towards theology than like translation type work. But yeah, huge figure, right? Anything you'd want to add on Jerome though, because I didn't sell him very far so far.
Those are big things. He's also Jerome is very interested in history. So,
Mm.
he's writing about church history up until his day, and he has a little bit more of a critical eye toward historical issues. He is a little more of like a scholarly kind of outlook at times, you might say. He's just a very studious man. And then the influence of Jerome is definitely something to emphasize. I mean, he's one of those figures from the patristic era that just casts a long shadow over the subsequent millennium or so. So Jerome, huge influence. But on the other hand, Gregory also has a huge influence.
Yeah, so Gregory the Great, only pope on the list, right? I think I've got that right. Yeah, because we took Leo off, um, and has a huge influence as a churchman. What are we, sixth century here? Sixth or seventh? Is it?
Yeah, sixth. I feel like he became pope around 590, and then I think he just barely made it into the 7th century.
Okay. Yeah, so around that time, I'm only familiar with his work through the Book of Pastoral Rule. I think you have a video on that. Excellent book, another book club book that we did. It's one that I would recommend to pastors. I don't know that I'd recommend it to everyone. It was kind of a niche choice for the book club. I think his insights into like human psychology, though, in it's part 2 or 3, it's towards the end of the book. He talks about kind of pastoring to opposites, so young and old, rich and poor, male and female. The way he's able to kind of contextualize teaching and talk about human relationships, I think is really fascinating. But he's also known for his work as pope. But what details would you want to fill in there?
Yeah, he did a little other writing. I think he's generally known as kind of more of an administrator and leader than necessarily a theologian. He's not super innovative, but his writings are fascinating to read. And I love the Book of Pastoral Rule as you do. I've done some writing on that myself. Another interesting part of his legacy is commissioning Augustine to do missions work in Great Britain.
Right.
So this is obviously has a huge impact upon church history. And I think he's generally regarded as one of those early popes who really grows the stature of the papacy and the influence. He's just such a capable leader and administrator and organizer and such an effective pope. So another thing about Gregory that's interesting is his sort of Eastern reach, because he was a papal representative in Byzantine for many years before he became the pope. And so he knew the East well, he had contacts in the East, and his works were translated into Greek much more than other Latin fathers were. So he has this kind of Eastern influence as well, and knowledge of the East as well, which is kind of an interesting, that's actually kind of rare at this point, because the East and the West start kind of splitting ways more and more and more. So I find Gregory a fascinating figure, and he, along with Boethius, are two people who they used to be, at the top of these lists, like throughout the medieval era. And then for some reason, their impact and their influence started slowing down in the modern era. And so Gregory the Great is much less known today. But for much of church history, he's one of those top most influential figures, which is kind of interesting how people can sometimes be more influential at sometimes than others.
It is interesting, and I had forgotten that point, but about his Greek influence. I remember reading interesting things about how he's like one of the very few whose works, maybe the only whose works in his lifetime were translated into Greek from the fathers. I don't know if that would be true of any others, but there's some fact similar to that, at least. But yeah, he's loved on both sides of that. Gosh, I don't have a strong inclination on this one. I'll admit these. I mean, Gregory the Great. I've read the Pastoral Rule and really enjoyed it. But I don't feel like I'm super familiar with the thought of either of these. It translating the Vulgate's a pretty huge deal. That's pretty big. But do you have a? Where are you leaning?
It's a tough one too. It's a little bit, but I maybe incline a little more toward Jerome. it, I kind of feel about him as I do toward Athanasius. He just rises a little higher on the landscape in terms of his prominence and his influence.
Yeah.
And is obviously the translation of the Bible was so influential. So I probably would incline there, but it's not an easy decision either.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the Vulgate. The Vulgate. Okay, Jerome. We are we have one final first round, and then it's gonna be some quick knockouts to get to the end. This is another hard one. We've got Maximus the Confessor and John of Damascus. So Maximus, both of these guys are kind of shaped by controversies, right? And kind of ecumenical councils. So we've got Maximus being influential in the monothelite controversy about the wills in Christ. Kind of like Gregory the Great, he's a figure that spans East and West, a very ecumenical figure in that he's trying to find middle ground. I believe he spends some time in the West. I know like Ed Sashensky's done some work on how he's trying to find middling positions on the Filioque already at this point. I think his thought is fascinating. He's another one who seems to be, along with Gregory of Nyssa, very popular scholar in scholarly circles today about kind of cosmic redemption and the scope of Christ's work. But then John of Damascus, we have a very interesting figure who's around the Seventh Ecumenical Council, big defender of icon veneration. Also, interestingly, the only figure I think on this list who's around after the rise of Islam, and he's engaging with that a bit. He writes a tremendously influential on the Orthodox faith, which is kind of multi volumes. Which is he's the last figure on this list, so he's kind of gathering up everything that's coming before him. On the note of kind of icons, it's been said that perhaps he was a better theologian than historian. I think that was actually conceded in a debate you had with Father Stephen DeYoung, if I recall correctly. But yeah, these two figures, I mean, they're huge. What would you want to fill in on either of them?
The great introductions, and I mean, so Maximus again, that dynamic of you have to respect someone who stands against the pressure, even though that's probably true to an extent for all these figures. But with Maximus, if I recall, I think his tongue was cut out and his right hand was cut off, or at least mangled in some way, so as to prohibit him from speaking and writing. And this is in the height of the monothelite controversy. And he's defending the Orthodox view, and he's sort of posthumously exonerated, but he's, you have to respect his willingness to stand against the pressure. But I love John of Damascus. I mean, so to me, so people sometimes call him the final father. And like you say, he's kind of summarizing a whole era. And because Eastern Christianity is often a bit foreign to us, to have someone like that who really does synthesize prior Eastern thought is so tremendously valuable. And John is also very influential, kind of like Gregory the Great, in the medieval era. You'll find him quoted all the time in Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, as the Damascene, or he's called other things too, I think. But so he's tremendously influential, and but he also has some unique views of his own. If people know the term perichoresis, meaning mutual indwelling, we use this term all the time for the Trinity, to say the Father, the Son, and the Spirit have mutual indwelling. That was an idea from John. If I understand correctly, prior to that, that term was used for the natures of Christ, and it was John who applied it to the Trinity. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Someone will correct me in the comments for sure. But that's my memory, is that the term was around for Christology, more for the Trinity, and then John did that. So, he does make his own contributions, but just and the last thing I'll say is the exact exposition on the Orthodox faith, or just on the Orthodox faith, is such a readable, compact text that it's another one of those good entry points that I think is so worthwhile to read. So John's just a great figure for getting into to Eastern patristic thought.
So we come again to a decision. It sounds to me like you're shading towards John. Is that correct?
Purely by vibes, because I don't know Maximus as well. Although, but he's fascinating. He's one that I've always been like, oh, I need to get around to reading him a lot more. I've really only read snippets.
Okay, so my experience is the opposite, because I've read more Maximus than John. In fact, I've never read On the Orthodox Faith. Like I've read parts of it, and it's perpetually on that list of like, yeah, I need to get to that, and I haven't, which is shameful. I know. I'll say for me, Maximus is one of those theologians. Occasionally, you come across people who you're like, it just reminds you of how expansive and how interesting theology is, because we can get bogged down in various debates, and then it's like, wow, this is an exciting, expansive view. This makes me want to do theology better. We might have to come to our first coin flip on this one, because I'm not sure.
I think we should go with Maximus with you. Okay. I think as I step back and look at it objectively, I think you're definitely right about that. That makes a lot of sense.
That's going to be an impossible matchup between him and Gregory. But we'll go back to the West. Okay, Ignatius versus Justin. Both early. I would say Justin's theology is more interesting. They're both martyrs, so I was going to give Ignatius. Ignatius is first. Ignatius might be more impactful today. That's hard. Ignatius versus Justin. Justin's more fresh in my head, but I don't know if that's just biased because I've just done work on him.
I think of Justin Martyr as like the quintessential apostolic father. Apostolic fathers meaning those first generation church fathers. Whereas Ignatius is a little more limited in his focus and in his volume of writings. So Justin Martyr, to me, just by stature, maybe just rises a little higher on the landscape. But so that's probably where I incline. But again, veto me whenever you want.
No, I was inclining that way too, but I'm just kind of shocked that I don't think I had him on my first list. I think I had Origen in his place, and he's making it to the semifinals. But I like it. I think he's really fun. I'll put it this way: if I had to spend say the next, like if I was going to go do a PhD and I had to pick between one of these two figures, I would definitely choose Justin. I think
Mm.
I would much rather spend a lot of time thinking about his work than Ignatius. And that's probably also just my bias of I like theology itself more than like the history of the church, even though that's so much of what my channel takes up. I think Ignatius is fascinating for the history of the development of the episcopacy and things like that. But I think Justin's just maybe more generative if I was to reflect on someone. So we'll give it to him. Athanasius Chrysostom. That's all. These are all going to be hard. I'm going to say that about all of them. Oh, I mean, first brush on this, just my very first inclination is if we go by the life of the people, I would go with the Athanasius. We've got more left from Chrysostom though, so like, who do you want to spend time? Although who you want to spend time with, studying isn't the litmus test. It's purely arbitrary vibes. But where are you at with these two? What's your gut?
Arbitrary vibes is a great way to summarize our method here. It's kind of impulsive decision making, but I incline toward Athanasius because of the uniqueness. I mean, I don't know another episode in church history like certain times in the 4th century when he really is, standing against the pressure, and that just stands out. I mean, when I think of like if I was teaching a church history class, like right now I'm teaching a church history class at my church. It's 10 weeks long. And I had a class on this, but if I even had just like 5 lessons from church history, one of them would probably be like the Arian controversy in Athanasius. So it just stands out as such a significant episode in church history, and his role in that was so singularly powerful that it's hard not to give the guy credit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, if I were to throw out another kind of litmus test here, what church history would look like without Athanasius, I think would be more different than without Chrysostom. I think Chrysostom's wonderful and gives us a lot, but doesn't necessarily like change the trajectory in the way that Athanasius does, or maybe doesn't change it, but like was at a really critical turning point. And, often we exaggerate the influence of like a sole figure, right? Like, because it's easier to tell history that way. It's like, the succession of these great men. But Athanasius is really one of those. Like, it was pivotal. So let's give it to him. Athanasius. All right. Augustine versus Jerome. Now, this is actually like a interesting matchup because they're the two heavyweights, I feel like, of the West, and are hugely influential going down. I don't want to predict the end, so I'll just speak about this one. I think it's hard to not give this one to Augustine, even though Jerome's huge in what he's done. Again, if we were to think about like someone, everyone who does translation work is going to hate me. Someone else could have translated the Vulgate, right? But could someone else have done what Augustine did? That's my impulse.
Mine too. I know, I'm with you. Yeah, and as much as when I hear the names Augustine versus Jerome, especially with having done videos on the canon recently, you think of them in that light. But just looking back at the whole of their thought, yeah, Augustine is such a great theologian and has such a good influence. It's hard to see how you'd pick Jerome over him, whatever the criteria are, So yeah, I think I'm with you on this one.
All right, Augustine it is. We've got our semifinals locked in, and we'll stay with going west then east. So for our first place in the final, it's Augustine versus Justin.
Now, wait a second. Did we do the final? Remind me who the final in the bottom right is.
Oh, we skipped it. No, you're right. Good. Okay. So we've got Gregory of Nyssa versus Maximus. I skipped it because I don't want to do this. This is awful. I love both of these thinkers. I'll say this is showing my cards. If I had to pick any two from this list to spend the next like 5-6 years working on, it would be one of these two. But that doesn't mean they're the best church fathers. I just think they're very interesting. I don't know. I'm going to ask you to give your first thoughts on this because this is hard for me.
Maximus is the more unique figure. Like you say, Gregory is kind of one of several in a certain time period. And honestly, a lot of Gregory's ideas are coming from the influence of Origen, perhaps. Maximus is a little more unique. So I don't know. Even though I was not initially thinking of him, I probably would incline maybe a little more toward him.
I think that's probably fair. And I mean, Maximus has the benefit of coming later. And so he has a little more to draw on. Um, yeah, I think he's just a fascinating figure. And, well, yeah, I was going to say something I really appreciated is about how he's trying to be this bridge, because I find myself trying to do that. So I'm not saying I'm like Maximus, but if I could have, a share in what he was trying to do, that would be wonderful. And so I think he might be, if we're going back to kind of generativity, um, I think Maximus. Let's go with it.
I
All
like it.
right. So now we go back to Augustine versus Justin. This it's just how brackets work out. This doesn't even feel like a fair fight in some ways. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously Justin's doing it earlier, and it's hard to do it with, he's got less to go on. But I mean, that's got to be Augustine. Right? Like, this feels like completely different weight classes here.
I agree. Yeah, any metric you use to compare those two, it seems to tilt toward Augustine, and Augustine is just such a massive figure in this time period. So it's hard. It's not surprising that he would win out over all these others.
Yeah, it's got to be him. I always knew he was going to be making it to the final. I don't think there was anyone on the left side that I could have put him up against in the first round that would have changed it. Like, some figures, who you go up against first could depend how far you make it. But Augustine was destined to be here, predestined, in fact, to be here. Maximus versus Athanasius. These feel a little apple and oranges to me, because the bottom half of this eastern side has been, for me, like, really interesting, intriguing thoughts with Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus, even John of Damascus, like, feel like very original theologians. Not that Athanasius isn't, but again, we've talked so much about Athanasius as a figure. I mean, Maximus, hey, getting your tongue cut out, like, that's impressive too, I guess. Um, yeah, to me, it's all going to depend on what I was privileging as far as who would win. But what are some of the thoughts or feelings that are coming up for you?
I could honestly go either way on this because Maximus is such a unique and interesting figure that I wouldn't have any downside in having him the choice from the East. On the other hand, he's very speculative, so there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
like Neoplatonism floating around in the way he thinks. Whereas Athanasius is not like that. He's not a speculative theologian. So it kind of, like you say, very much apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Either one is such a figure of great stature. Like you say, you got to love the fact that in these times where there's so much polemics, when you can find someone who's trying to find a mediating option, like you have with Athanasius. So, yeah, either one to me is a totally sensible choice. We're here on gospel simplicity, so I'm going to let you make the final determination.
That that is swaying my opinion, because you said the name of my channel, which it always comes back to bite me, the simplicity part of it. Because if it was on that, like, if I was to hand someone who I I feel like Athanasius is more trustworthy, and that, like, I don't feel like he's going to lead you astray, and both in terms of his personality, like in terms of his witness as a person, as well as his theology, like, I would just have less to worry about, or feel like I have to explain less to someone who's maybe not as mature in their faith. Um, Maximus, I think, is going to be fascinating, but maybe is yeah, there's more speculative nature to it. That makes it sound like I'm going to say Athanasius, but I'm going to go final answer on this, Maximus, solely because if I had to put two theologians in conversation, I think Maximus and Augustine makes a more interesting matchup than Athanasius and Augustine, because I think Athanasius and Augustine's theology probably maps closer together, and Augustine's just doing more, and probably deeper, but Maximus is maybe more different in a conversation with Augustine. So I'm going to go Maximus. We have our final, Maximus the Confessor and Augustine. I'm pretty happy. I feel like this is a good final.
Mm-hmm.
I'm satisfied with that. Obviously, we're just repeating things at this point. We've seen these theologians a lot. I, my initial thought on this is it feels like the like hipster cool theology answer to say Maximus, but Augustine. I mean, he's Augustine. This is like the Vulgate. But other than like just purely intrigue, I can't think of any other metric that Augustine doesn't win on. That's my first thought.
Yeah. I'm kind of with you, and it's not because there's things in Augustine that are not troubling, because there I've done whole videos on some of his views that are you know the damnation of unbaptized babies. That's something
Yeah.
that Augustine bequeaths to the whole medieval West, and it's so you find these things in Augustine that are pretty bracing, but in terms of his influence, in terms of his brilliance, in terms of his the benefits to be had by simply reading him, he's really tough to compete with. It's tough for me to imagine a world in which we choose Maximus over Augustine. How would we explain that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that Augustine has going against him in what you were saying there is it's almost like his own influence can come back to bite him at times.
Mm.
Like as far as the damnation of unbaptized babies, if he wasn't Augustine, does that stick around for so long? Like if any of these other people said that, I don't know if that has as long of a shelf life, but it's Augustine, so it stays around. And so it's the unfortunate part of like when you're that towering of a figure, maybe your less good takes are taken with more authority. But yeah, I don't know how we give it to anyone other than Augustine here. I think final answer is Augustine. Do you feel good about that?
I like it. I feel good about it. No one can. No one could say, "Oh, how could you choose him?" That's a very reasonable answer. It may not be the most edgy answer, but it makes a lot of sense when you look at who he was and what he did.
Absolutely. Gavin, this has been so much fun. I hope that people watching this had a good time. But this was a really interesting opportunity to just kind of talk about the thought of these great thinkers. I'll try to put links to some of the books that we discussed here, as well as I'll try to hunt down some of the articles that you referenced that you've done, as well as you have a book length treatment on Augustine. Um, so this has been great, though. Thanks so much for taking the time for this.
Oh yeah, it was a blast. Hopefully it'll inspire people to look into some of these figures. So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Absolutely.